It has been a while since I've uploaded a new video to YouTube, and this actually isn't a new video. This one is from our annual conference back in April 29th. And Dr. Howe, Dr. Richard Howe, was teaching on relativism. And so that's what this one is about. So just watch our introduction and have Dr. Howe.
All right, is this working? So let me just, in the interest of full disclosure and transparency, and the scriptures tell us to confess our sins one to another. There's a couple of things I think you need to know about me that you don't know from the introduction, probably won't necessarily notice during the presentation, but just so you'll know, first of all, I am bald. Okay, so just in case you were wondering. Second, I do have a Southern accent. Okay, in case you didn't notice that too. But I appreciate being here. I actually grew up in Mississippi. Now, I shared my Mississippi jokes. I love to go, when I go to different places in the U.S. especially, and I'm not in the South, let's say, and then I use my Mississippi jokes. First of all, I don't know if you knew this or not, but in Mississippi, if you get a divorce, you're still cousins. Okay? So it doesn't erase that, okay? Also, recently, a tornado went through the state of Mississippi. It did $400 million worth of improvement. But did you know, on a serious note, now this has nothing to do with having grown up there. Now, Rebecca and I now live in Atlanta. It was a lateral move, actually, but nevertheless. But this had nothing to do with me having lived in Mississippi. But I don't know if the statistics have changed recently, but at least until recently, Mississippi was the lowest per capita income of the 50 states and the highest per capita charitable giving of the 50 states. So I don't know what commentary that has on blessed are the poor there. Now, we may do a little philosophy here, but the talks aren't ostensibly on philosophy. Okay, but there may be some stuff that comes up that are philosophical. Now, oftentimes when, I'm sure this happens to Dr. Ray, when I'm asked to speak at a conference, they say, hey, would you be willing to do Q&A? So maybe if we've got a little bit of time, what I'd like to do is just carve out some time just for Q. And then you get a whole lot more questions in when you do just the Q. Don't worry about the A or whatever. So, but you will see here with my title slide what our topic is today. Do we have sound, Mr. Soundman? Okay, I know you're all thinking that's Mr. Soundman. Except it's Sandman. Hang on here, let me get this going. Please, you're embarrassing me. Please, everyone sit down. Okay, that's not funny anymore. That the please sit down only works if it's an audio, right? People are like, oh, they're giving the guy a standing ovation. What's going on here? All right, so Dr. Ray asked me to speak on relativism. And a couple of things I'd like to know, housekeeping. What I do with my PowerPoints is I make them into PDF documents, the slides, what is called a slide deck, and make those available. For my students, they're basically the class notes. So they get those. And so I want to have you, or let you be able to know how to get a slide deck of the presentations that you're going to see today. There's two reasons at least that you want to do that. One, invariably, we don't do all the slides. A lot of these things are created for classes that you have an entire semester, so you have to skip a lot of things. That's one reason. So you get the slides that I skipped, which has actually tempted me. I've never really done this, but I've been tempted when somebody goes and gets, say, a PDF, they're looking at a PowerPoint. If they didn't hear the PowerPoint, there may be slides there that they don't really know what it means, that they didn't hear the lecture that went along with it, especially if it's not one of the hidden slides, right? And so somebody may get it and they may see a slide and I didn't hear the lecture. What does that really mean? So what it's made me do is stick just a totally irrelevant picture. Wouldn't it be great? Right in the middle. It's like, yeah, Richard, I was listening to your existence of God. What is that watermelon argument for God's existence? I think people like watermelon up here, so maybe, so I don't know. So that's one reason there would be some slides hidden. Another reason is there might be some resources that I mentioned, a salient quote, and you don't have enough time to get the gist of the quote or write it down or especially see the citation. Well, what book was that in? So you go get the deck, you can write it down. So here's how you get the deck here. We got sound, Mr. Soundman. You can just leave that up if that's possible. So you don't want to miss this. Here, hang on a second. Just everybody talk among yourselves awkwardly while I redo this here. So they don't give this job to chimps, you know. All right, so here's how I'm not a web developer. Those of you who are web developers it's real static and cheesy, but I think the links all work there. So you'll want to go to richardghowe.com. Don't leave the G out. I can't guarantee you what you're going to get on the internet if you don't put the G there. So the way to remember is it stands for good looking. Okay, so that's easy to remember. And for some reason, Rebecca, everybody laughs. I'm not sure what's funny about that. But anyway, so you see across the top those tabs. So you won't see a flying hand come in, but you'll see it's pointing to resources that's blinking. It won't blink, but I'm just doing that to emphasize. If you click on resources, it'll take you to this page. Now, if I happen to mention, I don't know if this will come up, but if I happen to mention, hey, I've got a paper on my website, then you go to resources, click on papers. It's papers I've written, papers other people have written, PDFs you can download, links to things on philosophy, apologetics, theology, Bible, things like that. Same thing with multimedia. If I happen to mention that I've got, hey, an MP3, an MP4 that someone's done, links that on the internet, things you can download, Bible, philosophy, theology, apologetics, that kind of thing. Also bring you greetings from Midway Community Church, where Rebecca and I attend in Alpharetta, Georgia. Now, we actually live in Cumming, Georgia. We're pretty much as far away north of Atlanta as you can be and still be the Atlanta area. Now, that's actually changing, isn't it? Now, I think people are built out even 30 miles north of us. So at any rate, just things I've done over the years. I'm not on staff at the church, but things I've done off and on. Just throw it up on the internet. It's a lot easier. Some of that might be relevant. But the thing that's relevant for us today is this one here, and that is okay, let's just do it. I want to hear that again. Does it bother anybody if I just do that during the whole? This is really fun to do when you're doing breakouts and there's another group in the room right next to you. And they're going, what is going on over there? So this is that's the PowerPoint slide decks. So what it'll do is it'll take you to this page. This is basically an alphabetized list of all these PowerPoints I've done over the years. Most of them, or many of them at least, for classes. So you're welcome just to scroll down again and just click on the PDF and it'll give you the slides. Again, it's the slides. Oftentimes there's no lecture unless that happens to be somewhere on the internet. Some of those lectures actually are on YouTube somewhere that somebody recorded and put up, which I'm happy for them to do. I don't mind. But specifically, you'll scroll down till you get to relativism. We're going to do 2 of these 9 in effect, or 8, not counting the introduction, today. So I invite you to do that. And if you think about some question that comes up while you're doing it, then you're always welcome to email me. So we're going to start out this morning with relativism and faith reason. And then later, I think we'll just do these back to back with a short break in between. We'll do relativism and religion, all right? Just a few preliminary matters to get us going. Just to define the term, at least well enough that we can use it for the balance of our time together. When you say something is relativism about X generally means that X, or our knowledge of X, is different that is relative to different people. Another word for relative or relativism one might hear is subjective or subjectivism. Say, well, that's a subjective opinion, meaning that's just what what it is to you. Is it warm in here? Well, she thinks it's a little cool. Well, that's kind of subjective, perhaps. Now, just be aware, in case you are an aficionado of medieval literature, these terms, objective and subjective, are actually reversed in usage in English translation of medieval sources, like, say, Aquinas, for reasons that aren't very interesting. But just be aware of that. What we mean by subjective is what they call objective, and what we now mean by objective is what they call subjective. So as I said, the opposite of subjective is objective. For something to be objective for us means that it's the same for everyone. If it's 72 degrees in here, it just is 72 degrees, irrespective of whether one thinks that's cool or one thinks that's warm. And I would submit to you too, and look for this, but very often when I do talks, I submit things and I suggest things. That gets me off the hook of having to defend anything, okay? Well, we didn't have enough time. I'll submit to you that bald people are sexier than non-bald people. I just have to submit that, whatever. And you go, well, I don't know. Well, but I submit to you that not all subjective opinions, or subjectivism, if you will, is bad. Some relativism or subjectivism is completely normal. Like, for example, you compare asparagus with Brussels sprouts, and you asked, or someone asks you, is this tasty or not? Or is asparagus tasty or not? Is Brussels sprouts tasty or not? Now, I have my opinion about this, but I don't want to prejudice anybody else here, but I have an opinion as to which one I think is tasty and which one I think is not. But far be it from me to impose my opinion on anybody else. Although I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I do think the Hebrew word that's translated thistles and thorns after the fall is actually the Hebrew word for Brussels sprouts. That's what I've heard on good authority. But you think about it. If you ask, well, is that water deep or shallow? Well, it depends. If you're the little girl, it might get deep pretty quickly as it comes up to her neck, whereas it would only be barely to the father's waist there. So whether it's deep or shallow, it might be relative. How about big or little? Well, that looks big for a spider, but that baby elephant looks little, doesn't it? Even though the baby elephant is actually bigger than the spider. But relative to what a spider should be, or most often is, versus relative to what a baby is to the adult of an animal, then what we mean by big or little is going to change. So that's perfectly innocent, I think. But when it comes to the relativisms that interest us as Christians and doing apologetics, then it's going to be a lot more at stake. So just so you'll know what we do, or what I do in the class, it's an entire semester on relativism. What we do is look at relativism and truth, which Dr. Ray talks to this on a number of occasions. Relativism and knowledge, that's actually two-part, where I compare and contrast modernism and postmodernism, part one, and then part two, where I use the expression classical. I'll throw that around a little bit and explain it in a minute. So I'm contrasting modernism, postmodernism on one hand, and then the classical view of knowledge on the other. Faith and reason, which we're going to do today. Relativism and history, which really is plaguing us as Americans as history is being rewritten, and even what it means to be history is being challenged. Relativism and religion, which we'll do a little bit later this morning and before lunch. Relativism and morality, probably the relativism that those who are old enough, as Americans especially, are more used to running into. We were being plagued by moral relativism in the 50s and 60s in the U.S., and that was a challenge to us as Christians. It wasn't until the 80s or so that there began a relativism about truth, the first one that I mentioned. Relativism in the Bible, and then last, relativism in the gospel. And we take those one at a time through the semester. So we'll be doing these two as we go along here this morning. So let's start then with relativism and faith reason. When it comes to defining these terms, I want to just give enough of a definition to end up defending what I would argue is the quote-unquote classical view. Again, basically what I mean by classical, you might say traditional, although that word is a little tricky in the context of Protestant versus Catholic debates in terms, because in that debate, traditional becomes a sort of a curse word almost among Protestants as they denigrate what they think is an illicit appeal to tradition in Catholicism. So I don't want to confuse it with that. So I use the word classical, which also allows me to make either direct or indirect references to the roots of Christian thinking, even from ancient Greek thinking and its influence on Christianity, and then the church fathers, and templates and categories that were implemented as they carved out the creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and even the confessions of faith later on in the development of the church. There were various categories according to which we understand things like the Trinity, the two natures of Christ, the hypostatic union, things like that. All right? So we have to define faith, we have to define reason sufficiently, and then begin to unpack those. So let's start with some things about faith. The term is used in different ways in my experience. I'm only going to use one of them today, or point out one of them that's relevant. A kind of common use of the word faith becomes common with the word religion. Like, oh, he's of the Islamic faith, or he's of the Catholic faith, or the Protestant faith, or whatever. Then it has a more theological use, theological virtue, by which we are saved. For by grace are you saved through faith. There's something more going on than just mere reference to a generic religion there. There's something going on about what faith is. And that's kind of, I'll include some references to this as we come to our wrapping up. Well, what do I think faith actually is? But then there's a more epistemological use. Now, Ray's already used this term this morning. You're probably maybe familiar with it as an august group like this that does apologetics. But it just comes from the Greek word to experience. So episteme just means to experience. So epistemological is a term having to do with how we understand the nature of knowledge. How do we know things? Is there a difference between how we know that this is a dog and that's a tree versus there is a God or isn't a God and that kind of stuff? So it's how we know. So it's relevant now to our topic today, is how we understand reality. How do we come to know certain things about reality? With respect to uses of the term reason, what I would like to do, it's easier for me, rather than give a bullet list, is to watch the sort of portrait of what reason is as we contrast it off and on with faith in its various understandings in this relativism. So I think it's sort of easier to retrospectively then begin to see, well, what do we mean by reason? Now, why does this matter? You know why it matters already, but I'll tell you why I think it matters, and if this helps you, you can use this to try to convince somebody else why this matters. Why? Because otherwise, if you're like me, you talk about these things maybe to family or friends, and they just think, okay, well, what? What does this have to do with anything? You know, it sounds like ivory tower-ish or geekish almost. You're apologetic geek. But I would submit to you, here's another submission. Well, I won't submit this because this is actually true. I just won't defend it, but it's not something that's controversial, I don't think. In the Middle Ages, both Christianity and Islam wrestled with the relationship of faith and reason. They wrestled with that. What is the contours of faith versus reason? And what are the domains of each and the authorities of each? Is that light going off and on, or am I developing glaucoma right here in front of you? No, I'm just teasing. And so Christianity, by and large, medieval Christianity wrestled with that and more or less came to terms with this idea, which we'll unpack here in a moment, that faith and reason have a mutually beneficial relationship, or ought to, in the life of a Christian. That there's something each of them contribute to human flourishing and Christian flourishing, whatever that looks like. We'll get to that in due course. And what that did is that it allowed Christian Europe, if you will, to be open to new ideas like private property, or capitalism versus feudalism, the authority of the individual over the authority of the state. We, as the Declaration of Independence talks about, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence says. The idea, new ideas in science. We're all familiar to a greater or lesser extent the controversies that raged in the 16th century into the 17th century between the old Aristotelian Ptolemaic, the sun goes around the earth model, versus the Copernican and Galileo, the earth goes around the sun model. Rather the sun going around, I don't know if I said that right, but rather than the sun going around the earth, we came to believe the earth goes around the sun. That was a very painful transition. It took more than a century for Christians or Western Europe to come to terms and embrace that new model. It challenged us to try to reinterpret certain verses of Scripture. that seemed to clearly say the earth stood still and the sun was moving. And is there anything more obvious than that the sun moves across the sky and probably going north to south? It's like, no, it goes east to west in New Jersey, just like Atlanta. But anyway, I have no idea which way I'm pointing. Is there anything more obvious is there anything more obvious than this? There you go, is that better? Than it moved, right? So how did the Christians, and when I say Christians, I mean Christian Europe by and large, come to terms with this new idea in science? So whereas the Christian Europe was at least amenable to considerations of these new foundational ways of thinking because they gave a certain deference to reason and evidence over against what we at least used to think the Bible might have taught us, and try to find a way to reconcile the two. Islam basically did the reverse. That by and large, Sunni Islam in the Middle Ages opted for faith over reason. And you can study the development of Islamic culture from, centuries before, probably about the 8th century on. And there are many periods of Western history where Islam was the vanguard of scientific and philosophical and theological advance, in a sense. But all of a sudden that just gets arrested, and now we're fighting the ISIS and the caliphate, who are still trying to conquer all the nations, subject them to Sharia law, like most nations were behaving back then. Most nations conquered their neighbors and took their stuff. That's how you grow as a nation. But the Christians began to be open to diplomacy as a way of having peaceful coexistence with nations that had different languages and different cultures. And Islam wasn't that. So a book I would commend to you is Robert Riley's book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind. Some of you may be old enough to remember Alan Bloom's book back in the 80s, The Closing of the American Mind. It was on a different subject, but Riley obviously is playing off that title. And his subtitle is How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamic Crisis. So I commend that to your reading. You can actually hear Robert Riley give lectures on YouTube about his book. So let's quickly then run through. What I want to do is set up several things in just really brief analyses of what I consider to be the wrong view of these various views of faith and this relativism. Well, faith means this to this person means that. And here's where I'll skip some slides. To prove my point, I'll have quotations from a number of different sources, and I may give one, if any, at some of these points. But you can get the slide deck and find out what I'm meaning. So first of all, there's a popular misconception. Popular misconception. What is that? Well, there was a famous American lawyer who said, faith is believing in something when common sense tells you not to. Now, just think to yourself, who might have said that? First of all, in my mind, how many famous lawyers are there? And so that narrows it down pretty quickly there. But I'm being a little facetious because actually the lawyer was Fred Gailey in Miracle on 34th Street. Some of you remember that movie, right? This is what Fred Gailey is. This is his sort of take on life, happy-go-lucky, and he's falling in love with Doris Walker, who's real bookish and analytic, and their worldviews clash, if you will, as they're falling in love, but trying to navigate their various ways of looking at the world. And at some point it comes to a sort of preliminary climax in the movie where well, that just doesn't get you very far, Well, so it's the little intangibles. Faith is believing something when common sense tells you not to. She says it doesn't make sense, that kind of stuff. And we learn later on that even Doris herself has to be massaged a little bit by her daughter, Susie Walker, right? And then the climax of the movie, she finally comes and says, faith is believing in something when common sense tells you not to. I would submit to you that's the wrong view of faith. Okay? I just do that just to wake people up, okay? I submit to you, that's just the wrong view of faith, even though it's popular. In fact, here's where it impacts us as apologists. Because if you had somebody go, well, I think you really shouldn't give evidence and arguments because after all, that's going to sort of detract from the virtue of faith that someone has because they believe it completely absence of any faith and of any evidence and arguments and stuff. It's like a seesaw, and the less evidence you have, and maybe even more the absurd the claim is, the more virtue it is to believe that it's true, irrespective of what your in effect, what your mind is telling you to do. Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code,
I really
said
wasn't
it this
sure
way.
where to turn. Where science offered exciting proofs of its claims, whether it was photos, equations, visible evidence, religion was a lot more demanding. It constantly wanted me to accept everything on faith. As I'm sure you're aware, faith takes a fair amount of effort.
So you got to accept everything on faith. Why does it take a fair amount of effort? Probably in his mind, precisely because you're always having to work against just accepting it without any semblance of evidence or anything to that extent at all. So this popular method, then, you can juxtapose it in a lot of different ways. Faith is opinion, reason is truth. Faith is value, reason is fact. Faith is inner, reason is outer. Faith is private, reason is public. Faith is emotional, reason is rational. Faith is feelings, reason is thought. Faith is subjective, reason is objective. Faith is religion, religion is science. And faith is true for me, and reason is true for all. You get that subjective and objective. In fact, in some of the academic literature, the fact-value distinction that you see listed second is a very common expression used in literature, especially the whole philosophical era that was focusing on morality since Kant up through later thinkers. And it goes even back to David Hume of that distinction. Well, there's a difference between something being a fact and then something being a value and such. You also find a misunderstanding, a misconception, if you will, in this notion of faith among the new atheists. Now, the novelty of the new atheists has pretty much waned completely in my experience. But there was a period in the early 2000s, about 2008, let's say, where this new phenomena burst onto the American scene of an atheism that seemed to be unprecedented in a number of ways. It was more shrill. It was more appeal to the common man. It was not academic. And in my opinion, it was relatively uninformed of how the conversation about God's existence has been going on for 2,400 years in Western history, but who am I, right? So there's a lot of things that were new about it. Most of that sort of faded away, but I've not really deleted it from my PowerPoint. But probably one of the most brilliant among the new atheists was Sam Harris in his book, The End of Faith. Now, when Sam wrote this book, and I don't know if he sustained this opinion, but when he wrote this book, he would tell you the difference between a Christian who takes his family to church on Sunday morning and a Muslim who flies his airplane into the World Trade Center is just a matter of degree. It's just a matter of degree. And so whatever it is that is the bedrock of the Christian faith, it's the thing that causes the Muslim to fly his plane into a building. And so we've got to stave off this Damocles hanging over us as Americans to get rid of faith everywhere we go. Why? Because he thinks religious faith is the belief in historical and metaphysical propositions without sufficient evidence. Is that what we think? Is that what we've always thought as Christians? Faith is the mortar that fills the cracks in the evidence and the gaps in the logic, and thus it is faith that keeps the whole terrible edifice of religious certainty still looming dangerously over our world. Richard Dawkins, until Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, probably the one treatise that disabused more Christian college students of their Christian faith was Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. I think it got easily displaced by Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. If you know Frank Turek, I don't know if this is on the internet, but I know you can purchase the lecture from his Cross-Examine ministry called Intellectual Predators. And it's about how college professors are, in effect, intellectually preying on young people, or at least students, young or old, who may not have a grounding in the faith. That's why you guys see the importance, and this church sees the importance of grounding one's faith in reason. Richard Dawkins says, faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. You can also augment that by just your rank and file atheists. I mentioned Bertrand Russell, his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, and other essays on religion and related subjects. What does he say? As regards to the kind of belief it's thought virtuous to have faith, that is to say, to have a conviction which cannot be shaken by contrary evidence, or if contrary evidence might induce doubt, is held that contrary evidence must be suppressed. All right, now, you know, I've written a number of chapters that are in books, and I've co-written one book, but I haven't really written a book that's just I wrote it. But I have a lot of great titles for books. I'm not sure what the books will be, but I've got titles. So I thought I'd write a response to Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, and it'd just be Why I'm Not Bertrand Russell. I don't know what the book will be about, but I just thought that would be a great title. So I've got other quotes I won't take the time to go into now. George Smith, in his book, Atheism, The Case Against God, I teach an entire semester on contemporary atheism at the seminary. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. And we do popular atheism, new atheism, and academic atheism. This is the best book I've ever read at a popular level on atheism. So if you're looking for something that's what's the other side say, but I don't need the technical jargon of academic atheists necessarily that are philosophers, then you'll want George Smith's Atheism, The Case Against God. But I have a quote from him. Also, Peter Boghossian, when he spent most of his energy fighting the existence of God debate, but when he realized how bad the woke was in academics, he dropped that debate, said, it's almost, I didn't hear him say this, but it's almost to me as if he went, you know what, the Christians aren't the problem here. It's this critical theory. That's the problem. That's what's killing us. And he turned his laser beam intellect away from the question of God's existence, which is still relevant, but nevertheless, he's focusing now in his work on critical theory. So I appreciate some of the stuff he tries to do. What about neo-orthodoxy? Neo-orthodoxy plagued the church in the 80s. In academics, I was more or less a casualty of the debate over inerrancy. When I was a young Christian, saved at 16, wasn't raised in the church, even though I grew up in Mississippi. People joke about the Southeast being the Bible Belt, but I didn't know who Jesus was. I always believed in God, didn't understand the gospel, didn't know I needed saving until I got in high school. Friends of mine began to help me understand who Jesus was, what he did for me. I trusted Christ when I was 16, went off to university and lost my faith. Wasn't at all prepared. I don't believe a person can lose their eternal life. That's a debate Christians can have, but pending that debate, you can lose a lot of other things. And I lost my faith at a Christian university, okay? Because I was not, I'd like to think if my church had warned me about some of these battlefronts. Hey, be careful, because there are some people that profess to be Christian and may actually be Christian, but they got some pretty wacky beliefs. And so just be aware, and here's some good research. I didn't get any of that as a teenager. So I was totally blindsided when I went off to college and such. And part of the problem that plagued Southern Baptists especially was the influence of Karl Barth and neo-orthodoxy. So I have a quote from Barth and out of the debate he had with Emil Brunner over what is called natural theology. We're going to say a little bit about natural theology in tomorrow morning's sermon. So if you are inclined to come to church on Sunday mornings, first of all, if this is the church that you're inclined to come to when you do, then maybe I shouldn't have told you this, but I'm going to be doing the sermon in the morning, if you could call what I do a sermon. It's not really, but nevertheless, whatever. We're going to be doing that slot, and we're going to talk a little bit about natural theology. In fact, that's the title of the talk, is natural theology. In a shameless moment of self-promotion, I did a 6-week study, DVD and workbook study on general revelation and special revelation, out of which natural theology arises. So we'll talk about that tomorrow morning. Now, if you're not inclined to come to church, we invite you to do that. If you're not necessarily inclined to come here because you're a member of another church, in the love of Christ, what you could do is just skip your church. Do it in love, of course, but then come here and listen to a guest speaker. All right. Presuppositionalism. This is one of my favorite topics to beat up on. I'll avoid the subject today. Presuppositionalism is a method of apologetics that stands in stark contrast to what you're probably used to seeing when you study apologetics, what you hear from Dr. Ray and others around, which is called, for better or for worse, the classical apologetics. So they stand at loggerheads for the market share among evangelical Christians. So presuppositionalists believe in inerrancy. They believe all the great things in the faith. So they're not enemies in any sense, but we just go to town in this debate about, well, how do you do apologetics? And their great fountainhead of this method in America was Cornelius Van Til, who was a professor of apologetics at Westminster Seminary from about 1920 up until he retired. Again, they got quotes in there. Basically, they say you just have to start with the presupposition that the Bible is God's Word. That's your starting point. And I'm going, no, that's my ending point. That's what I'm trying to prove, because people don't believe the Bible. They say, why not the Book of Mormon or the Quran or something else? And I've got to be able to show them why these other books are false and that only this book is the inspired, inerrant Word of God, because that's the very thing in dispute. So I can't assume the very thing that's in dispute. Another thing that plagues the contemporary conversation over faith is postmodernism. This comes up on occasions in our conversations about apologetics because it looms so largely. This sort of relativism about truth. Stanley Grenz was actually an evangelical Christian who bought in to the postmodern thing, mindset, if you will. In his primer on postmodernism, he says this: in contrast to the modern ideal of the dispassionate observer, we, that is, postmodern Christians, affirm the postmodern discovery that no observer can stand outside the historical process, nor can we gain universal, culturally neutral knowledge as unconditioned specialists. Now, what does he mean by that? Standing outside the historical process means, for him, that no matter what idea you encounter, you're always going to deal with that idea against the backdrop of your own history, either as an individual or as a member of a culture. So in other words, he's saying you could never come objectively to what this idea is and is it true or not. You're always bringing your own narrative to that in your analysis. Now, I don't deny that that can happen, that people can have assumptions they're not aware of, and it may thwart or at least modify their ability to understand an idea. When you preach the gospel, they may have some ideas in their mind that keeps perverting what you're trying to say. And I don't deny that that's true. But that can't be always the case. Why? Because Stanley Grenz wouldn't have been able to say that that was the case. In other words, I go, so you say that no observer can stand outside the historical process. So, Professor Grenz, are you telling me that your observation that no observer can stand outside the process is just a product of your own historical process? Well, no, he thinks this is really the case. So without even acknowledging it, he thinks he has a privileged perspective. And his perspective is, you know what? There aren't any privileged perspectives. That's his perspective. It's self-refuting. Nor can we gain universal cultural and neutral knowledge as unconditioned specialists. Does he think that's only true about a small group of people? No, he thinks it's universally neutral knowledge. That there is no universal neutral knowledge. It's completely self-refuting. But this plagues so much, I think, of the Christian faith. And I have a lot of quotes from postmodernists there that you can get. So let me then contrast that with how I understand, for our purposes, what I call the classical view of faith and reason. And here, let me just define it more or less and then attenuate my definition to our concerns as Christians. Classically, and I mean traditionally, I mean by and large, not everybody, but a large segment of the voices of the luminaries from church history, from the church fathers until yesterday, say this: believing something, reason is believing something on the basis of demonstration. Now, I'm going to unpack that in a minute. But for right now, if somebody makes a claim and the reason you believe that claim is because you've seen it somehow demonstrated to be true, whatever demonstration means, we'll see what that is, then you classically would say you believe it on the basis of reason. Faith, classically, is believing something on the basis of authority. Authority. So there may be things that you and I believe, the demonstration of which is beyond us or is outside of our reach. Maybe it's a discipline I'm not skilled in. We were talking about mathematics on the way here, and I hit the glass ceiling or whatever you call the metaphor of learning mathematics when I was in high school. I go, okay, that's my limit. I couldn't go any farther. There may be things. In fact, one of my favorite illustrations of this is Fermat's last theorem. And the reason I like it is because I get to say Fermat. I get to roll my R, because we don't roll our R's as Americans. So Pierre de Fermat, and I feel like I have to say that with a French accent and wear a beret maybe, Pierre de Fermat. So Pierre de Fermat was a mathematician, 17th century basically. He was a contemporary of René Descartes. No, I'm sorry, that was stupid. Nothing worse than a French accent with a Southern accent, right? They were contemporaries, and so what's interesting about Fermat and what this last theorem is, just to illustrate this point, is that over his course as a mathematician, he proposed many theorems in mathematics. Since Fermat's day, every one of his theorems that he's proposed has been proven either to be true or false. Some of them he proposed, it turns out he was wrong. Some of them he proposed, it turns out he was right. Except one theorem, and they've never been able to prove whether he's right or not. on this. It's the most amazing thing. So it became known as Fermat's last theorem. It's very simple. You remember the Pythagorean theorem when you were in school? X squared plus y squared equals z squared. So if you take the side of x, square it, take the side of y, square it, add them together, and then take the square root of that, it gives you the length of z. Okay? Pretty simple to understand. Here's what Fermat proposed. He basically said that equation, x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n, has no solution in integers where n is 3 or greater. In other words, there's no x to the third plus y to the third that's z to the third. There's no x to the fourth plus y to the fourth that's z to the fourth in whole numbers. Now, you couldn't just brute force prove that, right? Because there's an infinite whole number of whole numbers. But Fermat said, when he was writing in the margin of a book that he was reading, he said, I have found the most ingenious proof, but it's too large to fit in the margin. And he never mentions it anywhere else in his writings. They never saw the proof. So it just became this enigma among mathematicians. It's like, what? Is he right or wrong? And they've never been able to prove it until 1998. And Andrew Wiles of Princeton University proved that Fermat's last theorem was true. Now, if you want the resource you can find, his solution to the equation is published in the Annals of Mathematics, Modular Elliptic Curve in Fermat's last theorem. It's 111 pages. Probably not Fermat's solution to it. In fact, you can get the summation of the solution on a T-shirt if you want. It's a conversation starter. What is that? It's Fermat's last theorem. What is it? I don't know. For me, that's where the conversation would end. He's some guy that had a French accent or whatever. So there it is. I can get to the Fermat's last theorem, let N, A, B, C, and then I'm gone. Okay? That's it. So, but here's the point of the illustration. If you ask me, well, do you believe Fermat's last theorem is true? I would say yes. Well, how do you know it's true? Did you see the demonstration? Well, no, I don't. I don't understand the demonstration. I'm not a mathematician. And I asked John Lennox. Rebecca and I had the pleasure of having dinner with John Lennox and his wife one evening. And I brought this up, and he said, there's like 4 mathematicians in the world today that can understand Fermat. So, no, I can't understand. Well, then why do I believe it? Well, because Andrew Wiles says it's true, and his associates at Princeton and other high-level universities, they all say it's true. Now, am I a fool for believing these accomplished mathematicians for telling me that it's true? I think I would be a fool for not believing them. Why? Because they're mathematicians and they understand it, and they told me that it's true. In other words, my belief, my faith that Fermat's last theorem is true is not completely absent reason, because reason is what tells me that Andrew Wiles was an authority to be believed. Does that make sense? I just don't believe any yahoo that comes along. Somebody walked in here and said, hey, I got a great money-making deal. You give me $1,000 today, and I'll turn it around and give you $2,000 next Saturday. Oh, okay. It would be foolish to give him $1,000 if we had no idea who he was. But if he came in with a portfolio and he had endorsements from people you trusted otherwise, from the pastor, from the leadership, whatever, you still have to decide whether you're going to entrust this person with your $1,000. But in that situation, it's not credulity. You're taking a risk maybe to some extent, but you still go, well, I'm not a total fool because he does have a track record of investments, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of the difference between taking something because you know it's true by demonstration, whether it's mathematics, or taking something on authority. So what we do in the philosophy course is we unpack a little bit more of this notion of demonstration. But let me summarize it by saying this. A demonstration differs according to that aspect of reality about which a statement is made. So Fermat made a statement about the mathematical aspect of reality, right? So the demonstration for mathematics is going to look different. But if somebody said, well, they're thinking that the weather's going to clear up Monday in New Jersey. Well, that's not a mathematical question, is it? No, that's a meteorological. Well, what does that look like? That looks like you take the tools and methods of meteorology and you run it through the sieve and you come to a decision about it. So you could think of all the different disciplines, and they have their own methods and protocols and things of demonstrating truths within that discipline. right? Whether it's mathematics or history or philosophy or theology or whatever it is. Now, there are common elements. They all use language. They all use logic. They all use ethics, since they all assume everybody's telling the truth, right? There's things that are common, and they're common because it's human beings that are common among all of those. But what I found in my own life and students is making the mistake of allowing someone to get away with challenging your Christianity on the basis of something that's not the right discipline. Like I remember as a young Christian, well, can you give me a mathematical argument for the existence of God? I should have said, no, God's not a mathematical object. Mathematical argument, did I say object? Mathematical argument for the existence of God. And I say, no, I can't give a mathematical argument for God. He's not a mathematical thing, right? I can give a philosophical argument because the question of God's existence is philosophical. It's not mathematical. So don't let somebody bully you. That happened to me in a debate at University of Georgia State University on atheism. And a gentleman got up and said, well, who are you to say the question of God is philosophical? And I was sort of taken aback, because that's like asking somebody, well, who are you to say that the study of plants is botany? It's like, well, no, it's not that we were looking around going, what study do we give to the botanists? Plants? Okay, we'll give them the plants. Okay, you guys do the plants. It's the other way around. The people that study plants, we give the label botany. As self-serving as it is to say, people that dispute the evidence for and against the existence of God include philosophy. Now, it can appeal to other disciplines too, like the natural sciences or whatever. So when it comes to this, for our purposes then, as Christians, what makes it really important is understanding things on the basis of divine authority. Now, that doesn't necessarily just mean the Bible, although that really is what it ultimately means for us. But we're going to juxtapose or compare and contrast that tomorrow morning in our service when we talk about how God also reveals himself through creation. So Augustine said, for who cannot see that thinking, that is reason, is prior to believing, that is faith. For no one believes anything unless he has first thought that it is to be believed. So reason plays a role, but faith will have a role as well. But they're not in competition. They're just different ways of coming to a settled conclusion about a claim. And if you believe it because you've seen and understood the demonstration, that's believing it by reason in terms of how that term's used classically. But if you believe it because it's either something you can't demonstrate or you don't have the aptitude or the discipline or whatever, discipline like mathematics or something, then you're said to believe it by faith. So in the presentation, I not only appeal to Augustine, I also appeal to Thomas Aquinas. I also appeal to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, just so we can say, hey, this isn't a Catholic-Protestant issue. This is something Catholics and Protestants are in solidarity on, or at least were, for for several centuries after the Protestant Reformation. Again, this is self-serving to say, and maybe something will come up tomorrow morning. But the fact that Protestants have grown such an animus towards academic philosophy as a role in the life of the soul is a development subsequent to the Reformation. It's something that happened in the Reformation or among Protestants several centuries later. So I give a Catholic quote, I give a John Calvin quote, and then others. If you want a written version of this conversation that I'm making about philosophy and its role, Norm Geisler was the co-founder of Southern Evangelical Seminary. Rebecca, basically, her connection with the seminary is probably older than anybody alive now. I think that's because now that Norm Geisler's passed away. So the seminary was born in her church in Charlotte, and she basically ran the school while Geisler taught the classes until it started growing. So I have a chapter in there titled, and I don't get residuals for this, so I'm not hawking any wares here, Defending the Handmaid, How Theology Needs Philosophy. So you can get that. So it was a Feshruf. A Feshruf is a book published in honor of a living person. So these are a collection of articles by associates, colleagues, friends, and such. So let me end with this. When I was a college student, the Southern Baptists, I don't know if they still do this, they used to have this opportunity for college students to take 10 weeks out of their summer and do mission work, either in the U.S. or overseas. And it would give you a taste to maybe come to a decision about whether you might want to do missions as a ministry. So I did that as a college student. And ended up being assigned to an inner city of a large city in the U.S., working with inner city children in vacation Bible clubs for that summer as a 19-year-old. But during our orientation, it's like 1,000 of us. We're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for orientation before we all split up to our assignments. And the leader got up, he said, okay, so one thing we want you to do, students, is we want you to pair off with whoever's next to you, doesn't matter whether you know them or not, and just go off by yourself. We want you to share the gospel with one another. Because hopefully you're going to have opportunities to do that during the 10-week summer. So, okay, and there's a young lady next to me. We just sit down in these bleachers in this big gymnasium. Ladies first. I said, go ahead. And she says, well, Jesus died on a cross. And I went, okay, question. Now, I wasn't trying to be a jerk, but I asked her, I said, 3 people died on crosses that day, what we call Good Friday. There were 3 people that died. What makes his death any different from the other 2? And I'm thinking, that's what I'm thinking people might ask us. Like, well, lots of people died on crosses. Thousands of people died on crosses. What's so special about him dying on a cross? And she's like, I don't really know. So we talked about that during our few minutes, whatever. And I use that as an illustration to make this concluding point. I submit to you, it can be demonstrated historically that Jesus Christ was crucified. That is a historical fact. And that can be demonstrated as certain as any fact of history. Probably one of the most notorious is not the right word, but one of the strongest opponents of Christianity and the Bible among the academics right now is a man named Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Bart, now he's an atheist or agnostic, and he thinks the Bible's full of errors, blah, all this kind of stuff. Okay, fine. He was on an atheist internet radio show, and people are calling in, asking questions, and they're beating up on the existence of God. Finally, one caller calls in and says, Jesus probably never existed, much less died on the cross. He probably never even really existed. And the host is like, oh, yeah, probably. And Bart goes, guys, this is kooky talk. No historian denies the historicity of Jesus and his crucifixion. Nobody. That's like saying there wasn't a Holocaust or we didn't land on the moon. He was trying to get his fellow atheists to go, you need to retire this because this is just crazy talk. Don't go around with this. How do we know? Well, we know it through the tools and methods and protocols of history, whatever that looks like. And it's as certain as anything could be known from history. But I submit, it had to be revealed to us what was different about his death from the other 2. That is, we have to come to understand who Jesus was, his claims to deity, being God in the flesh. We have to understand sin. We have to know that there's a God, which that may be a reason thing for some people, and that we've broken his law and we stand in judgment before him. And our only hope is that he will give us his righteousness as a gift, as Romans 4, verses 4 and 5 say, to him who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as a debt. But to him who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. That's a quote from Genesis 15. How is that? It's given to you. It's given to you as a gift. When Abraham died in Genesis 26, he was described by the narrative as a man who, God is describing him, a man who kept all of my ordinances, statutes, laws, and commands. The reader is supposed to notice as he's reading this in Genesis, there aren't any ordinances, laws, statutes, and commands in Abraham's day. That's the language of Mount Sinai. That doesn't happen until Exodus. That's not even, that didn't exist. How could Abraham have obeyed all of God's laws, ordinances, statutes, and commands? And the answer is the verse that Paul quotes in Romans 4 from Genesis 15. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. That's what the reader's supposed to notice. How could he have obeyed all the laws? There aren't any laws because of the imputed righteousness. So that is by faith. Now notice that the truth that Jesus died for our sins had to be revealed to us by God, but it's no less a fact. So this isn't a fact-value dichotomy. It's a fact that Jesus paid for our sins. It's just that, in a sense, the only way we can ultimately come to embrace that is we have to trust God when he tells us that that's what he's done. I can't demonstrate that. You can't demonstrate it in the same way we can demonstrate that he actually died. So we take a risk, if you will. I'm being a little facetious. It's not a risk to take the word of an omniscient, omnipotent, all-good being, right? That's not a risk. But at any rate, all right, why don't we take a quick break, and then we'll come back maybe in about 5 minutes. I have no idea why I'm doing